So how comes you kicked off your own label?
So I got to a point where I was making a lot of music and I couldn't necessarily find a fitting home for them. Either I had to adapt my music to fit the sound of a label, which wasn't ideal. And big shout out to my mentors Tristan and Sammy for basically encouraging me to kick off my own label. At the time, I didn't have the foresight for it, and I just didn't think it was within reach. But luckily with a few meetings, I was able to launch a label with the help of Juno, and yeah. So I decided to launch my label to have something that represented me. Ultimately, I was putting music out there on other labels, and although you somewhat build an identity through that, I wanted to build something very pure. And with the encouragement of my mentors, Tristan and Sammy, uh, they basically gave me a bit of a kick up the arse to create my own label. At the time, it didn't seem like it was within reach, but putting my head down, making sure that all the tracks were ready to press, I was able to work with Juno and have them distribute these records. So, yeah.
So how comes you kicked off your own label?
So the label idea came around through wanting to build my own identity and have something that represented me entirely. At the time, I made quite a few tracks, and in terms of finding a home for them, either I had to adapt my sound to another label or it just didn't feel too right. So I hit up my mentors, Tristan and Sammy, and they told me to ultimately build a brand, build my own record label, and center everything around that. Uh, I didn't think it was within reach. I just, sound having a record label, vinyl only, it did seem like it was quite far out of reach. But thankfully, with a few oh, fucked
So
it.
good, man.
So I got to a point where I built a catalog of tracks up, and ultimately reached a point where they needed to find a home, and I felt like I was bending my sound a little bit from maybe other labels, and that weren't quite right. So had an honest chat with Tristan, my mentor Tristan da Cunha, so shout him out. And yeah, at the time he was like, these tracks aren't, I wouldn't push them for other record labels, like create your own brand and push it through that. And at the time it felt so out of reach and there was a lot of frustration, but it was worth it in the end. I took a lot of time making sure that the designs for the label were right, that it found a right home in terms of distribution. And yeah, thankfully I'm at the point now where I've got, you know multiple EPs lined up, but we'll get to that in a bit.
So how comes you kicked off your own label?
The label idea came around because I put together a catalogue of music and I got to a point where I was starting to send some stuff out, and I felt like potentially I had to kind of bend my sound to another label, which just didn't feel right. And, you know, I wanted to be proud of every single release, and so far I have been, but I want that to continue. And I reached a bit of a point where I needed a seeked advice from Tristan, so that's Tristan da Cunha, so shout him out, where he basically was like, save this stuff, uh, you know, don't let other labels sort of take your shine, create your own shine through your own thing. So thankfully, I spent some time with the design on the label, making sure that we had the right people doing the distribution, which is Juno, so shout them out. And yeah, I've found this beautiful home in Born to Be Free where it's just going to be now like, a hub for my music. The label idea came around from me just building up a catalogue of tracks, and then at a point where I wanted to find a home for them, I started sending stuff out, and I felt like I potentially may have had to bend my sound for certain labels, and it just didn't quite feel right. So there was like a little bit of a frustration building up, and I reached out to my mentor Tristan, Tristan da Cunha, so shout him out, and he gave me some really solid advice about, you know, don't give your shine to other labels, and kind of keep your shine, create your own brand identity, and build it up that way. And at the time, it seemed quite out of reach, having a EP pressed on vinyl. It was just, it was an idea sort of far down the line. But I wanted to accelerate that, so I spent a lot of time making sure that the designs were right and the branding was right for the label, and finding a good home in terms of distributor. So shout out Juno. And it's now given me a really solid release pipeline now, where I can build my own identity and make sure I put out music to the best of my quality. So the idea actually stemmed from a particular point I reached in my production, where I built a catalogue of tracks, and I wanted to ensure that for each EP, for each release, I wanted to maintain a level of being proud of each one, and ensure that the tracks found the right home. And I felt like I hit a bit of a wall in terms of not finding the right home, and potentially maybe even having to bend the sound of my music to fit that label, which wasn't quite right. So I hit up Tristan da Cunha, who's one of my mentors, and we had a hard and long chat about plans. And he was like, why don't you create your own label, there was something that stuck with me, which he said is, you have a shine that other labels will benefit from, but why don't you just retain that shine and grow it through your own brand and label? So that's what I did. I spent a lot of time around the design, making sure that we found the perfect home in terms of distribution. So shout out Juno. And that's ultimately where the so the idea around the label actually came around a bit of a frustration on having to bend my sound for other labels. I built a catalogue of tracks, and when sending them out, it just didn't feel quite right. So I hit up Tristan da Cunha, one of my mentors, so shout him out. And he gave me some really sound, solid advice. And at the time, it was quite hard to hear, because I really wanted to get my music out there. But I had to remain patient, and it definitely paid off. I spent a lot of time on the designs for the label, making sure that that was right, and finding a good distributor. So shout out Juno. And we're at a point now where we've got the test presses, and it just feels crazy being able to hold my own record with my music on it. Yeah, it's just nuts.
So,